Have you ever believed that a wild animal, one born to survive, to fear, to run, could recognize a human face, even after 30 long years? This isn't just another story about survival in the wild. This is about memory, instinct, and a moment in time that refused to be forgotten. In the frozen heart of Barrow, Alaska, where blizzards roar louder than any voice and silence can feel heavier than snow itself, nature tested the bond between man and beast. In a place where temperatures plunge to 45 degrees C, even the most resilient creatures fall. But sometimes, when the odds scream impossible, something extraordinary breaks through. One such moment happened on a night buried in white, a night lost in a blizzard so fierce it felt like the sky itself was collapsing. In that storm, a young boy named Inupiat, barely 10, faced a decision that would defy everything he had ever learned about survival in the Arctic. He came from a family of Inupiat hunters and fishermen, people who respected nature, feared it, and never interfered with its laws. But that night, nature bent. There was a sound, a faint, trembling whimper in the howling dark. Not human, not wind. Something raw, something desperate, something alive. And as Mike stepped outside his family's igloo, wrapped in a thick parka stitched by his grandmother from caribou hide, he saw it. A polar bear cub, alone, trembling, collapsed near the remains of a discarded trap, its fur matted with ice, its breath barely visible in the Arctic air. His heart pounded, his breath caught. Every elder's warning echoed in his head. Never approach a wounded bear. Where there's a cub, there's a mother. And where there's a mother, there's danger. But there was no mother. Only the cub. And a boy. Both caught in a moment that neither had chosen, but both would remember. Mike knelt. He looked into the cub's eyes, wide, black, full of fear. And something else. Recognition? Hope? The child in him said help. The wild around him said run. It should have ended there. It should have been a story of fear and retreat. But it wasn't. Something ancient passed between them in that moment. Something older than instinct, older than tradition. He couldn't walk away. What happened next would not only alter Mike's life, it would create a connection so profound, so inexplicable, that it would return to him decades later in a way no one could have predicted. This is a story of compassion, of impossible survival, and of a wild creature's memory that would astonish the world. But to understand how this unlikely bond began, you have to go back to that very night, the one locals still whisper about. The storm they compare to Williwaw 74, a whiteout so violent it buried snowmobiles and silenced radio signals across the Arctic Circle. And yet, amidst that chaos, something quietly began. A story not of power, but of gentleness. Not of the wild attacking the man, but of the wild reaching out for help. And Mike? He made a decision that would go against everything he'd ever been taught. What he didn't know was that someone or something would remember. Forever. Inupiat was no stranger to survival. In Barrow, Alaska, life wasn't about comfort. It was about understanding the rhythm of the land, respecting its silence, and never underestimating its storms. Born into an Inupiat family, Mike grew up hearing the cracking language of the ice more than that of machines. His people had lived with polar bears for centuries, hunting, coexisting, fearing them, and at times honoring them like spirits from the ancient world. For them, the polar bear wasn't just a predator. It was a symbol of strength, solitude, and deep, dangerous wisdom. Every winter, Mike and his father would migrate to a remote edge of the northern coast, far from the hum of town generators, to fish through frozen sheets of ice. They built temporary igloos, lit with seal oil lamps that flickered with stories of ancestors and shadowy spirits. Meals were simple: fresh-caught Arctic char, frozen berries, dried seal meat. Water had to be melted. Heat had to be earned. And everything depended on the weather. The cold was a constant teacher. Mike had learned young that whiteouts could kill you within minutes, that bears could sniff you from miles away. That silence often meant something was watching. And above all, never ever interfere with the wild unless you were ready to face its judgment. Yet that fateful winter, something changed. It wasn't just the storm that broke all the rules. It was Mike's heart. He had always been a curious child. While his father was stern and rooted in survival, Mike wandered. He'd watch the stars for hours, imagining what the world looked like beyond the tundra. He sketched in the snow with a stick, making animals out of memory. But his favorite thing to do was observe the wildlife. He loved the way the Arctic foxes danced across the ice, the heavy breath of moose in the early morning. And of course the bears, their hulking presence, their dignity, the fear they commanded, and the strange unspoken connection he felt with them, especially the young ones. He'd seen cubs before, always from a safe distance, always under the watchful eye of their mothers. But this one, the one from that night, was alone. And nothing in his years of wisdom, no stories from elders, no warnings carved into the wood of their old sleds, could have prepared him for that sight. The bear cub was barely breathing. The trap that had injured it was one of the old ones, illegal now, forgotten by most, buried in the snow from a time when poachers roamed these lands under moonlight. Its small body was curled up, almost disappearing into the snowdrift, like it was trying to hide from the world. And maybe it was. Mike stood frozen. The snow stung his face. His father's voice echoed in his mind. If you see a bear alone, it's not alone. Walk away. Always walk away. But his feet didn't move. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to whisper beside the seal oil lamp. About bears who spoke in dreams. About spirits that took animal form to test the hearts of humans. About a time when compassion could change destiny. It all felt like legend. Until that moment. What would his ancestors have done? Would they have turned their backs? Or would they have listened to something deeper? He took one step forward, then another. As he reached the cub, it didn't react. No growl, no snap of teeth, only a slight tremble and a weak, rattling breath. Its eyes fluttered open, dark, glassy, afraid. Mike took off his parka. It was nearly as big as he was, made from stitched caribou hide with fur lining and an old patch sewn into the chest, a gift from his mother before she passed. He wrapped the bear with it, barely feeling the cold now pulsing through his arms. The cub made a faint sound, more like a sigh than a cry. He lifted it. Stumbling through the wind, one arm under the bear's frame, the other gripping a hand-carved spear for balance, Mike made his way back to the igloo. His father stood at the entrance, stunned. For a moment, the man didn't speak. Then his voice broke like thunder. "Are you out of your mind?" Inside, the air was thick with steam from boiling snow. His father argued, paced, threatened to throw the bear back into the storm. But Mike held firm. "It's dying," he said. "It's just a baby." That night, Mike stayed awake beside the cub, feeding it drops of melted snow from a carved bone spoon. He whispered stories. Not human stories, but the kind you tell with your presence. "I'm here. You're not alone. Not tonight." His father watched from the shadows, conflicted, torn between tradition and the trembling life under their roof. For 3 days, the cub barely moved. But slowly, its breath steadied. Its eyes opened more often. It nuzzled into the parka as if it remembered something from before the cold. Mike never named it. He didn't need to. The bond didn't require words. And then, on the morning of the 4th day, a low hum vibrated through the ice. A snowmobile, wildlife rangers, responding to radio signals from his father. They came in with gear, questions, and a crate. Mike didn't say much. He only watched. As they took the bear, it squirmed, gently, not violently. Its eyes searched, and then locked with his. There was no roar, no drama, just a stillness, a pause. And in that pause, something unspoken passed between them. The cub was gone. But what remained was a silence unlike any Mike had known before. Not the silence of snow, not the silence of fear. It was the silence of connection, a silence that lingered, a silence that would stretch across years and wait patiently to return. And the silence wouldn't be broken Until 3 decades later when a fully grown bear returned, carrying something that shouldn't have survived time. The wind outside the igloo had turned violent, not just cold but alive, ripping through the night like a wild spirit. Mike had never heard the Arctic speak like this before. It howled like it was warning him, like it was trying to drown out a sound it didn't want him to hear. But even in the chaos, that cry cut through, thin, desperate. A sound that didn't belong to the wind. It wasn't a wolf, it wasn't a fox, and it wasn't human. It was something else, something trembling and terrified. He stood at the edge of the igloo, heart pounding, breath turning to ice in front of his face. His father had already disappeared back into the sleeping firs, muttering that the storm would take care of whatever made that sound. But Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he was being called, not by fear but by something fragile asking for a miracle. He wrapped himself again in the caribou parka, the same one that had clung to him like a second skin since childhood. It smelled like smoke, salt, and old snow. He didn't tell anyone he was leaving. He didn't even fully understand why he was. Step by step he moved into the storm, the ice crackling beneath his boots. He knew this landscape better than he knew his own thoughts. Every snowdrift, every bent tree, every hollow in the white. And then, he saw it. Tangled in a half-buried, rusting steel trap, its legs scraped raw and frozen to the bone, was a polar bear cub. It couldn't have been older than a few months. Its body was skeletal beneath layers of soaking fur. Frost clung to its face like a mask, and its breathing came in painful, uneven gulps. One of its paws twitched every time the wind shifted, as if it was still trying, still fighting. Mike stopped cold. Every instinct he had, everything he had been taught screamed inside him. Don't move, don't get closer, call for help and wait. Because even a cub could be dangerous. Even a cub could be bait for something much worse. But there was no mother in sight. No tracks. No growl from the shadows. The cub was utterly alone. And dying. He crouched slowly, trying to read the animal's body language the way his grandfather had once taught him. Look at the eyes. The chest, the breath. Look for the truth beneath the fur. What he saw was pain, but also trust. Not full, not blind, but a kind of surrender. Like the cub had decided that if this was the end, maybe, just maybe, it didn't want to die alone. Mike's fingers trembled not from cold but from doubt. He was 10 years old. He wasn't supposed to decide life and death, but the silence between him and the cub had grown deafening. And in that silence, there was a weight, a question. Will you walk away or will you stay? He looked around. Nothing but white. The storm was folding in on them like a blanket of ice. If he turned back now, the cub would be buried within hours, forgotten beneath snow and wind like it had never existed, like its tiny beating heart had never mattered. He couldn't accept that. Kneeling into the snow, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the knife his father had given him on his last birthday. A rite of passage for any young hunter. But tonight, he wouldn't use it to cut meat or skin. He used it to pry open the old trap, bit by bit, ignoring the way his fingers went numb. The bear whimpered, weak but alive. Mike whispered without thinking, "It's okay. I've got you." Once free, the cub slumped to its side, too weak to stand. Mike didn't hesitate. He pulled off his parka again, his only real protection against the wind, and wrapped it around the bear. It smelled of human, but the cub didn't flinch. He lifted it as best he could, awkward and heavy in his arms. Every step back to the igloo felt like dragging his legs through cement. The wind clawed at him. The cold bit through his sweater and burned his skin. But he didn't stop. Inside the igloo, his father sat up the second he stumbled in. "What is that?" he snapped. Mike didn't answer. He lowered the bundle gently onto a sleeping mat and peeled the parka open. The cub made a small noise, almost like a cough. His father cursed under his breath. "You've doomed us." Mike finally looked up. "I couldn't leave it." The fire in the center of the igloo flickered against the bear's wet fur. Steam rose as snow melted from its body. Mike knelt beside it, scooping bits of snow into a bowl and holding it close to the fire until it turned to water. He offered it in a small wooden ladle carved by his grandfather. The cub sniffed, then sipped. That was the moment. That tiny sip of warm water. That choice to trust. His father paced like a wolf trapped in too small a space. What happens when it grows stronger? When it remembers what it is? Mike said nothing. He knew he didn't have the answers. He only knew what he felt. And what he felt, stronger than fear, was empathy. He saw himself in that cub, trapped, scared, small, wanting to survive but unsure how. They slept little that night. The wind screamed. The walls of the igloo trembled. And yet, inside, something impossible was unfolding. Each hour the cub seemed to breathe deeper. Its body, once curled tight in pain, began to stretch. It drank more water, licked snow from Mike's fingers. It still couldn't stand. But it looked at him, not with fear now, but with presence, like it knew who he was. Mike's father kept his distance. He brought more firewood, melted more snow, but he never touched the bear. He wouldn't speak to it, but he watched. And over time, his anger softened into something else. Not acceptance, but a kind of quiet respect, because even he couldn't deny what was happening. Mike never named the bear. Naming it would have meant claiming it, and this cub wasn't his to claim. It was just a life, one he had chosen not to abandon. By the third day, it tried to stand, wobbly, shaky, but determined. Mike was there, holding his breath, watching every trembling movement like a parent witnessing a child's first steps. The cub collapsed again, but it didn't cry. It simply lay its head on the parka and closed its eyes. That morning, his father finally said it. "I sent a radio message. The wildlife patrol is coming." Mike nodded. He knew what it meant. It meant the bear would be taken away. It meant this impossible connection would end. But still, he nodded, because helping the cub was never about keeping it. It was about doing the right thing, even when it hurt. He sat with the bear until the snowmobile engines could be heard in the distance. The cub raised its head at the sound. It looked at Mike, then pressed its nose against his hand. No growl, no panic, just a moment, a connection, and that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. And little did he know, the cub would carry it too, because sometimes when a bond is made not out of fear or force but out of compassion, it doesn't fade. It waits, quietly, until the day it returns. That night inside the igloo, the wind outside still shrieked like it was trying to pull the walls apart, but it couldn't drown out the storm building between father and son. Mike's arms trembled as he laid the injured bear cub gently on the padded mat made of stitched caribou hide. Not from the cold, though it was biting, but from a weight that settled deep inside his chest. The kind of weight that comes when your heart dares to challenge everything you've ever been taught. He had disobeyed, not just his father, but the sacred rules of survival. He knew what the elders said. He had heard it since his first steps on frozen ground. Never interfere with the wild. Respect it. Observe it. Learn from it. But never ever try to change its course. Doing so invited danger. Doing so meant taking a risk that didn't just affect you, but everyone around you. In the wild, every action echoed. And yet, here he was, kneeling beside a creature who should have been a threat, but wasn't. His father stared at the bear like it was a curse brought into their shelter. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, voice tight with restrained anger. "You've brought death into our home." Mike didn't answer. He couldn't. The words just wouldn't come. How could he explain something that had no logic, no tradition behind it, only a feeling? A feeling that had told him, "Don't walk away." The cub was wrapped tightly in Mike's parka now. Its breathing was still shallow, but steadier than it had been out there in the snow. Its nose twitched every now and then as if trying to process this strange new world it had been brought into. A world of human fire, of flickering light, of heat and strange smells. But what held Mike in place were its eyes. Even weak and crusted from cold, those eyes had depth. They weren't wild in the way he had expected. They were searching, soft, and somehow, incredibly, calm. They didn't plead, but they invited trust. And trust in the wilderness was not a small thing. Mike reached out and laid his hand gently on the bear's side. It didn't pull away. His father watched from the far corner of the igloo, arms crossed. That thing grows teeth, claws. You won't be able to stop it if it turns. You think it knows you saved it? You think it cares? Mike whispered, I don't know. And he didn't. But he believed something had passed between them, something silent and sacred. The fire hissed as another log popped. The cub let out a low sound, almost like a sigh. Mike leaned in, adjusting the parka to make sure no heat escaped. In the glow of the lamp, his face looked older than 10, weathered, determined. His father paced for a long time, then finally sat down without another word. It was not acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was that gray space that men of the ice lived in, the space between instinct and possibility. Time passed slowly. Every breath the cub took felt like a victory, every twitch of its paw like a whisper of hope. But Mike's mind never rested. What if his father was right? What if the cub turned aggressive once stronger? What if it brought predators near their camp? What if the rangers didn't come? What if, by helping one animal, he had risked both their lives? He wrestled with the questions all night, eyes wide in the dim light, thoughts spinning faster than the wind outside. Every decision in the Arctic had consequences. There were no second chances here. Only survival. Or not. But then he looked again at the cub, and something inside him settled. Because even with the weight of uncertainty, even with his father's anger, even with every rule of nature screaming otherwise, he felt peace. For the first time in his life, Mike had chosen compassion over fear. He hadn't made the safe choice. He'd made the right one. And even if that choice led to danger, at least he wouldn't carry the regret of turning away. Outside, the storm began to fade. The wind eased just a little. The snow still fell, but not with rage. And inside the igloo, the only sound was the soft crackle of fire, and the breathing of two living beings who by all odds shouldn't have met, but did. And the connection that had begun in ice and silence now burned quietly between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about meaning. Have you ever faced a decision where compassion clashed with reason? Tell us your story in the comments, we'd love to hear. Mike didn't know what would happen in the morning. He didn't know what he'd say to the rangers when they arrived. He didn't know what the cub's future would look like. But he knew one thing for sure. He had answered the call no one else heard. And something deep in his soul knew. The wild was listening. 3 days later, the storm was just a memory. The wind had calmed, and the sky opened above Barrow in a pale wash of blue, the kind that only appeared after the land had been thoroughly tested. The world was silent again, but not in the same way it had been before. Inside the igloo, the cub was sitting upright now, still weak but stronger. It had begun to move on its own, wobbling in place, stretching stiff limbs. Its wounds had started to close. The limp was still there, but its eyes, those eyes, were no longer filled with desperation. They were alert, curious, and unmistakably alive. Mike watched it constantly, afraid to blink, afraid to miss something. He'd become attuned to every sound the cub made, the way it snorted in sleep, the quiet shifts as it breathed, even the small purring sound it made when warming near the fire. They had fallen into a rhythm, not quite boy and pet, not captor and captive, but two beings bound by a shared moment of survival. His father had stopped protesting. He still refused to get close, still wouldn't speak to the bear. But Mike had noticed him glancing over when he thought no one was watching the cub eat, or stretch, or blink those solemn, intelligent eyes. It was on the morning of the 4th day that the sound of a distant engine broke the stillness. A low hum first, then the unmistakable growl of a snowmobile. Mike stood frozen in the doorway. His father stepped beside him, quiet. "They're here." Mike didn't answer. The words sat heavy in his chest. Within minutes, 2 figures appeared on the white horizon, slowly approaching on snowmobiles packed with crates and gear. Bright orange parkas, wildlife insignia stitched over their shoulders. One was a woman with weather-worn cheeks and alert eyes. The other, a tall man with a thick beard, carrying a tranquilizer rifle slung across his back. They greeted Mike's father first, brief, respectful. Then their eyes shifted to the igloo. "We got the signal. Said you had a young bear inside, that true?" Mike's father nodded. "My son found it. He's the reason it's alive." The patrol stepped inside and paused. The woman's gaze softened as she saw the cub. It had risen to its feet but didn't run. It stared, as if assessing them. "Never seen one so calm," she murmured. "Especially not after an injury like that." Mike said nothing. He knelt beside the cub again. It nuzzled into his knee like it had done the night before. "We'll need to take it to our station in Utqiagvik," the man said, setting down a plastic carrier with thick padding. "There's a wildlife recovery unit up there. They'll treat the leg, monitor the behavior, make sure it can be safely released later." Mike nodded slowly, but his hands curled into fists. The woman crouched down nearby, speaking in a voice like she was used to calming frightened animals. "You did something remarkable here, kid. Most adults wouldn't have risked what you did. You gave it a second chance." He didn't feel heroic. He felt like something inside him was being pulled out by the roots. They opened the carrier. The cub, sensing something had shifted, backed slightly toward Mike. It looked up at him, then at the strangers. Its breathing changed, shorter, sharper. Mike whispered to it like he had each night. "It's okay." But this time, it didn't believe him. The patrol moved slowly, professionally. They didn't sedate the cub. Didn't need to. It allowed them to lift it gently into the crate, though its head twisted backward the entire time. Eyes never leaving Mike. Then, just before the lid closed, the cub let out a low cry. Not loud, not panicked, just mournful. Like a goodbye it didn't want to give. And Mike broke. He stood in the snow as the crate was latched and strapped to the back of the snowmobile. He watched as the machines revved to life, pushing through the snowdrifts back toward civilization. He watched until they became dots. And then nothing. No sound, no movement. Just silence. The kind that doesn't feel peaceful, the kind that feels like a door closing. He dropped to his knees, the snow soaking through his pants, his hands bare against the ice, but he didn't move. His chest tightened in a way he didn't understand. Like grief, but stranger. He didn't know how to explain it. Not to his father, not to himself. Because how do you mourn something that isn't gone but no longer yours? His father walked over and stood beside him. For a long while he said nothing. Then, his voice low, he murmured, "You did what you had to." But Mike didn't want logic. He didn't want praise. He wanted that small body back in his arms. He wanted those eyes looking at him like he mattered again. All he could do was press his hand to the patch on his parka, the one the cub had curled against every night. Still warm. Still carrying the faintest trace of something wild and deeply, impossibly familiar. And that was the last time he saw the animal. Or so he believed. 30 years passed like waves against the shore. Slow, constant, eroding the memory until only the strongest parts remained. But for Mike, that winter never fully left. It clung to him like frost on old bone. The image of the cub looking back at him through the bars of the crate. The soft cry it made. It haunted him in quiet moments. It would surface in dreams, in the smell of melting snow and the sound of distant howling winds. That kind of connection doesn't just fade, it waits. As Mike grew older, his life took a different shape. He left Barrow for a while, studied environmental science, photography, and Arctic wildlife conservation. But something always pulled him back north, something deeper than nostalgia. It was like a thread tethered to the frozen wilderness that refused to let him go. A thread wrapped around a memory, and the face of a bear cub who should have been forgotten. Eventually, he became a wildlife photographer, well known in certain circles, mostly for his work capturing polar bears in their natural habitat. He'd spent decades tracking their migrations, documenting the effects of climate change, watching ice shelves collapse under the weight of a warming world. And every time he saw a bear, a mother with cubs, a lone male crossing the floes, his mind flickered, uninvited, to that one. Could it have survived? Could it have remembered? He told no one that he hoped it had. Now, in his 40s, Mike had returned to Barrow once more. Not to visit family, not even for the memories, but for a project, a documentary for an environmental group raising awareness about the vanishing Arctic ecosystems. It was late spring, but snow still covered everything like a warning that winter wasn't ready to let go. He set up camp in a remote stretch of tundra, far from the town. A small, insulated shelter powered by solar panels, outfitted with camera traps and motion sensors. He was here to observe, to gather footage. But what he got was something else entirely. On the third night, just as he finished organizing footage from the day, mostly shots of melting ice shelves and distant seals, his monitor screen blinked. One of the outdoor motion cams had picked up movement near the tree line. He glanced over, expecting a fox or possibly a caribou passing through. But it wasn't. What appeared on screen made his heart stop. A polar bear, huge, muscular, scarred, and walking with a slight limp. It approached the camp slowly, not stalking, not in a rush, with purpose, deliberate. Mike's breath caught in his throat. Something about the way it moved, its posture, its gaze, felt different, not threatening, not curious even, almost familiar. He moved quietly to the window of the shelter, careful not to trigger any exterior lights. There it was, just beyond the snow berm, close enough now that he could see its breath in the air, could hear the soft crunch of its massive paws pressing into the snow. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't angry. It was just there. And then he saw what it was carrying. In its mouth, gently gripped in its jaws, was a torn piece of fabric, frayed, faded, and unmistakably old. Mike's blood turned to ice. He knew that color, that stitching, that patch. It was his parka, or at least a torn fragment of it, the same one he had wrapped around the cub 3 decades ago, the same one the cub had slept in, bled on, and finally left behind when the patrol took it away. There was no possible way it had survived all those years. And yet, here it was. The bear walked forward until it was just meters away from the camp. Then, without a sound, it dropped the fabric gently on the snow and stepped back. It looked straight at the shelter. At him. Mike stepped outside. Slowly. Cautiously. But not with fear. The cold stung his face and the snow crunched beneath his boots, but everything else, the wind, the ache in his knees, the disbelief, all faded beneath the thrum of his heartbeat. The bear didn't move. Its head tilted ever so slightly. Its eyes were dark and calm. And Mike, he couldn't speak. He walked until he stood only a few feet from the scrap of fabric. He knelt, picked it up. The texture rough in his hand, stiff from age and ice, but real. Undeniable. The bear exhaled. A long, deep breath that steamed the night air like smoke from an ancient fire. And in that moment, Mike wasn't a photographer, or a conservationist, or a man chasing images of extinction. He was a boy again. A boy who had once defied every law of survival to save something wild. And that something had come back. He didn't know how, didn't know why. There was no logic to it. The odds were impossible. Polar bears don't imprint. They don't carry keepsakes. They don't recognize human faces. But this one did. Mike stood still, fabric clenched in his hand as the bear blinked once and turned. It didn't run, didn't roar. It simply walked away, back toward the horizon, toward the edge of the tree line, toward whatever lay beyond the reach of understanding. Mike stood there until the shape disappeared into white, and even then, he didn't move. Because some moments don't need to be chased. They come to find you. And this one, against all sense and science, had found him. But what did it mean? Was it gratitude? Was it coincidence? Or was it something deeper, an echo of a bond that never truly broke? Mike didn't have the answers. But the torn piece of parka in his hand, the quiet breath of the bear, the deliberate way it had looked at him, those were not things he imagined. And deep inside, beneath layers of time and reason and survival, he believed. Mike didn't return inside right away. He stood in the freezing wind long after the bear had vanished into the white. The fragment of fabric still clutched in his hands, the moment still echoing through his body. He could feel the silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of something sacred, something heavy, something alive. There are moments in a person's life when reality feels too fragile to hold the weight of what's happening. This was one of them. He had no explanation. No camera could have captured the energy of that moment. And yet it was real, tangible, etched into him like a scar made of awe. He looked down at the piece of fabric, his parka, torn, aged, but unmistakable. How had it survived 3 decades? And how, above all, had the bear come to possess it? Had it carried this relic for years, tucked away in a den or buried in snow? Had it returned to the place of their meeting? Had it remembered the warmth, the kindness, the scent of safety? It wasn't just about memory anymore. It was about intention. That bear had come with a purpose. Back inside the cabin, Mike didn't sleep. He sat in front of the fire, the fabric laid out before him, staring into the flickering flames as if they might provide answers. But what could fire know about fate? He thought about the past, about the boy he had been, small, brave, stupid maybe, but willing to risk everything for something fragile. He had made a choice that night not based on logic or tradition, but on something older, instinct. And now, that instinct had returned, not in thought, not in dream, but in fur and breath and bone. By morning, he had reviewed every camera angle. The outdoor motion sensors had caught it all. The bear's slow approach, the way it paused at the edge of the light the moment it dropped the fabric, the way it turned back to look into the shelter. But somehow the footage felt hollow compared to what he had experienced. The cameras captured what happened, but they couldn't explain why. In the days that followed, Mike didn't speak to anyone about what had occurred. Not the documentary team, not the local rangers. This was no longer a story for headlines or grants or television specials. This was personal, deeply, sacredly, personal. Instead, he returned to the same spot each night, sat in the snow where the bear had stood, waited in silence. No camera, no gear, just the memory and hope. Nothing came for 3 nights. But on the 4th, movement again. This time he didn't check the monitor. He stepped outside without hesitation. And there it was. The bear. Not as close as before, but visible, just far enough to be seen, just close enough to feel real. It stood in the moonlight, frost clinging to its fur, eyes watching him with that same unreadable depth. It didn't move forward, didn't retreat. It was waiting. Mike didn't bring food, didn't raise a camera. He simply walked out, slow, respectful, heart pounding in his chest like the wings of a trapped bird. He stopped just a few feet from where the bear had been last time and sat down, cross-legged, open, still. The wind danced between them. For what felt like hours, they simply existed together. No threat, no expectation. Just 2 lives suspended in a quiet, neither fully understood. And then, movement. The bear stepped forward, not rushed, not aggressive. 1 slow step, then another. Mike didn't flinch. Every cell in his body screamed with adrenaline, but his heart, remained still. The bear stopped only a few feet away. Its massive breath fogged the air between them. Its eyes, darker than midnight, locked with his. And in that look, Mike saw it. Recognition, not instinct, not reaction. Recognition, like 2 old friends meeting again on a path neither thought they'd ever walk twice. It moved its head slightly. Not a bow, not a gesture, but something close. Mike whispered, not knowing why. "You came back." He didn't expect a response, but the bear gave one anyway. A low, almost inaudible sound escaped its throat. Not a growl, not a warning. It was something else, like a murmur of memory, like a voice made of snow and time. Mike didn't reach out, he didn't dare, but the bear moved closer, 1 step more. And then, it sat. The snow shifted beneath its weight. It huffed once, and then, stillness. Side by side they sat, the man who once saved a cub, and the beast who had crossed time to return the gesture. It was surreal, impossible, sacred. And Mike, tears frozen on his face, understood something that defied everything science had told him. This bear remembered. It remembered warmth. It remembered safety. It remembered him. And it had come, not to seek, not to take, but simply to give something back. A moment, a connection, a truth that only they would ever know. They stayed that way for a long time. The moon passed over the tundra. The stars blinked in the cold sky above. And still they remained. Eventually the bear rose. It turned its head again, one final glance, then walked away. No sound, no farewell, just quiet steps fading into the trees. Mike remained where he was, not out of fear, not out of shock, but out of reverence. He had been given something few ever are, a moment outside of time, a moment where the wild didn't roar or bite or flee, but remembered. He returned to the shelter eventually, not to sleep, but to write. Not everything, just pieces, enough to remember, enough to make sure he'd never question if it had really happened. The next morning, there were paw prints all around his camp. Slow, looping, thoughtful paths. Not hunting, not circling, visiting. He pressed his palm into one of them, the size of a plate, deep in the snow. For a second, he imagined his 10-year-old self standing there too, watching, smiling. And that piece of fabric? He wrapped it in a box of cedar bark and tucked it into his pack, away from the gear, away from the noise, because it wasn't just a relic. It was proof. Not that bears remember like we do, but that something in the wild remembers something in us, and sometimes, just sometimes, it finds its way back. Mike didn't leave the Arctic for several weeks after that final night. He continued his work, documented the environment, and checked the camera traps daily. But something inside him had shifted. The mission had changed. It wasn't just about data anymore. It was about something felt, something not found in textbooks or footage, something deeper. Each morning, he would walk the perimeter of his camp, quietly scanning the horizon, not in search of danger, not even out of habit, but with a sense of quiet longing, an unspoken hope that the bear might return just one more time, just to sit, just to exist, just to remind him that what had happened hadn't been a dream, but it didn't return. And maybe it wasn't supposed to. Some connections, he realized, aren't meant to become routines. They aren't meant to be repeated. They're meant to live in one place, one breath, one sacred moment, and echo for the rest of your life. He found himself walking slower, listening more, watching the way the wind moved over snowbanks, the way distant birds flew in wide arcs. He noticed details he had forgotten to see. It was as though the bear had reawakened something in him, not just memory, but presence. There are things science can't explain, bonds that stretch beyond time, beyond logic. That bear shouldn't have remembered, and yet, it had. The moment it looked into his eyes, Mike knew he wasn't being mistaken for anyone else. The recognition was too deep, too specific, too real. What did it mean? Was it simply animal intelligence? A coincidence of scent and timing? Or was it something more, something ancient, some hidden thread between kindness and memory? He didn't know. And honestly, he didn't need to. Some stories aren't for solving, they're for holding, for feeling, for honoring. And that's what this was now. Not just a memory, but a story worth telling. A story that might remind someone, maybe even you, that compassion is never wasted, that no act of love disappears, that the wild remembers more than we think, and maybe, just maybe, it remembers us. Where in the world are you watching this from? And do you believe animals can truly remember us like we remember them? I'd love to hear your thoughts below, because this story still lives, and your voice is part of it. As the final days of the expedition passed, the Arctic began to shift. The long, brutal cold gave way to whispers of change. Tiny melt streams formed at the edge of the ice. Snow softened. The sky stretched wider with streaks of pink and gold, the kind of colors that only appear when winter finally lets go. And Mike felt it, inside and out. He had come for footage, for documentation, but what he had found was far more powerful than any lens could capture. He had rediscovered a piece of himself that had gone quiet. The part that had believed all those years ago that connection could exist between species, that kindness wasn't forgotten, that the wild was listening. He had never spoken about that winter from his childhood, not publicly, not even to the documentary crew. The story had always felt too fragile, too unbelievable. And besides, who would have understood? But now, after everything, he knew he had to share it. Not to prove anything, but to preserve it. Because some stories are more than events. They are reminders, mirrors, messages we carry into the world. Mike sat by the fire on his final night in camp, writing in his journal by hand, his gloves off, fingertips raw from the cold, the scrap of the old parka folded neatly beside him. He wrote not with facts, but with memory. He described the bear's eyes, the way it breathed, the sound of its paws pressing into the snow like footsteps through time. And as the fire dimmed and the last night settled in around him, he smiled, not with joy exactly, but with peace, because he finally understood. The bond had never ended. It had simply waited for the right moment to return. And even though the bear had walked away, it had left something behind, not just the fabric, not just the silence, but permission to believe that the world isn't as cold as it seems, to believe that our smallest actions, especially the ones born from compassion, can echo further than we'll ever know, and to believe that what we give in love somehow finds its way back to us. When Mike packed his bags the next morning, he moved slower than usual. Every zipper, every strap was deliberate. He stepped outside one final time, turned in a full circle, and let his eyes take in every frozen line of the land. No bear tracks, no movement, just silence. But this time the silence wasn't empty. It was full. And maybe that was the greatest gift of all. A quiet that didn't demand answers, a quiet that held memory, a quiet that knew something extraordinary had passed through. He left Barrow not with sorrow, but with reverence. He didn't cry. He didn't ache. Because the story wasn't over. It had just changed shape. It would now live in the hearts of those who heard it. Those who saw themselves in the young boy who chose courage over fear. In the cub who allowed trust to guide it. And in the man who learned that some things, the right things, never leave us, even when we think they're gone. So now you know. A story that started with a boy and a bear didn't end in the snow. It lived on, in memory and instinct and something unspoken but undeniably real. If you've stayed with us until now, it means this story touched something in you. Maybe a memory, maybe a question, maybe a quiet reminder that compassion never disappears. It just finds new ways to return. And that's what this channel is all about. Real stories, deep emotion, connections that cross the boundary between species, and the walls we sometimes build around our own hearts. If you believe the wild has a voice, if you believe animals remember, if you believe kindness echoes across time, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. So take a moment, right now, to hit that subscribe button. Not just to support this channel, but to become part of a community that believes in something more. More than just content, more than just views. We believe in connection. And the next story? It's already waiting. Right there. On the screen now. Click to continue. Let the next chapter begin. Because out there, in the wildest corners of the world, the heart still remembers.